Well, good evening, everyone. On behalf of RMIT University, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurrung and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we're meeting tonight, and pay RMIT University's respects to their elders past and present. And RMIT University also acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia in which the university conducts its business, and also recognises that sovereignty was never ceded. So really delightful to welcome everyone here tonight for a joint event that we're hosting with the Planning Institute of Australia on the topic of funding essential housing. So RMIT and the Planning Institute of Victoria have kind of an ongoing relationship through a memorandum of understanding where we collaborate on research and engagement activities, and so this event tonight is part of that relationship, and the third such forum in a series of three associated with the Victorian state election, which will be happening in November. And as part of the conversations leading up to the election, Pia identified a set of key sort of topic priorities for its campaign around the election, including climate change, regional planning and development, and housing funding and affordability. So this session tonight is the third in the series of the PIA RMIT election forums. So tonight we're talking about the topic funding essential housing, which encompasses principally social and affordable housing. And the topic is inspired by the recognition that we face serious housing need in Melbourne, in Victoria and across Australia in the current era. Efforts over the last couple of decades to grow the stock of social and affordable housing have not been sufficient to meet the level of need that we're certainly seeing coming out of the pandemic period. And with interest rates rising, there's pressure on household finances in relation to mortgage repayments. There's increasing rental stress in the private rental market, and that is in turn putting pressure on the social and affordable housing sector to provide accommodation for those who are struggling in the market. So this question of funding essential housing is incredibly pertinent at this point in time, and is unlikely to go away as a pressing issue in the near future. So tonight's session is to deliberate and debate on questions around how we can fund essential housing, and is in partly inspired by or responding to some of the debates that were occurring in Victoria earlier this year around leveraging urban development to generate a stream of financing for social and affordable housing through the levying of a development charge on new residential development in Victoria, which was announced, debated and then withdrawn by the Victorian state government. So a very timely moment in the context of a forthcoming election to be thinking through that experience and looking to the future as to where the planning system and the financing system might go in terms of supporting essential housing. I'll introduce the panellists in just a moment, but before doing so, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the QR code in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide in front of you, which is there. If you click on it, it'll take you through to a link which is an appeal for support from the Planning Institute to support the Young Planner of the Year, the National Young Planner of the Year, Nick Camlos, who has been invited to attend the COP27 conference on climate change in Egypt in November, and the Planning Institute is keen to support Nick with the costs of that travel, representing the Institute and representing Australia. So if you would like to find out more about Nick's trip and the COP and the role that he'll be playing and the way that it's possible to support him, I'd encourage people to point their phones at the QR code and click through and consider contributing. So that's just a brief aside. So into the panel conversation, we're joined by three esteemed experts on housing and urban policy and urban planning tonight. We have Emily Hobbs, who's a Planning Institute member, a senior consultant and partner with SGS Economics and Planning. We also have Sarah Tui, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Housing Industry Association of Victoria, and has recently come out of an advisory role in government, closely related to the topic of tonight's conversation. And we also have Professor Libby Porter, who's also a Planning Institute member, and I'm pleased to say a close colleague of mine working in the Centre for Urban Research here at RMIT. So I think this should be a really terrific panel with some great perspectives amongst the panellists. So I will now hand over to Emily. The format is to have every panellist offer some opening remarks, and then I'll throw some questions at them, and then everyone in the audience will have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. So over to Emily, 5 minutes on how we can fund essential housing.
Thanks so much, Jago. I have to admit I was a little unprepared for the opening remarks, so I'll just reflect a little bit on some of the recent work that I've been doing. SGS was involved in quite a large study with Housing All Australians recently, looking into the benefits, or actually it was the cost savings from not providing sufficient or providing sufficient social and affordable housing. And I don't think I probably need to, a crowd who will well appreciate that that the benefits far outweigh the costs, and this piece of work definitely demonstrated that. So as a bit of a framing for our discussion on how we go about it and what the hurdles might be in the political sphere and all of those other questions, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are a huge range of benefits, not only to the households who are living in the households, but also the communities that they reside in the broader metropolitan regional areas, and also for governments as well. There's quite significant cost savings to government. So those areas, the benefits are in brown: improved health outcomes, reduced domestic violence and decreased engagement with the criminal justice system, enhanced human capital, educational benefits, both for children who are able to study and have improved outcomes through more stable options at home, and also for adults whose reduced financial stress means that they can engage in other training and upskilling activities. And also enhanced labour market productivity. If we're providing more mixed communities and people able to live and reside near their workplaces, travel less stress, then we have better and more efficiently functioning labour markets, which is actually is one of the largest benefits. And of course, one that's not really easy to measure, but more diverse and inclusive places, which I think we can all appreciate is a good thing. It has reputational kind of components for cities. Our community sense of pride is enhanced by having more mixed communities, and there's a whole range of other benefits. So just to quote a few numbers, because we all like numbers, we found that in Victoria, if you meet the need for social and affordable housing to 2051, the benefit's $10 billion, undercutting it, $10 billion. And of that, $4 billion would be cost savings to government. So obviously there's a huge imperative here and a really clear message to government to get involved. And we are encouraged that government is getting more involved as we go along, that state governments committed to 12,000 social dwellings over the next few years through the big housing build, and also 30,000 additional dwellings to the Future Australia Fund. So they're commendable commitments. We probably are all well aware that this falls short of the actual need, and we'll probably discuss this more as we go along, but it's a good first step. So obviously there's a shared responsibility. Federal government, state government, and also local places and planning processes have a role to play, and state and federal government, they're doing their bit, they've committed something, and we'd like to see more. But the discussion tonight will be about how the planning system and those development processes can also contribute. We're very disappointed by the knocking down of the social and affordable housing contribution, but I think it sets a really great precedent for future action. We know the pitfalls of what happened, and we know how to reorganise and communicate and get our messages clear. And as a PR member and divisional committee member, I know the committee are really going gung-ho in this election round about seeing a revised commitment from state government to social and affordable housing contributions. So, yes, that's it from me. That's my opening remarks.
Great, thank you, Emily. Over to you, Sarah.
I'll start by clearing my throat. But that dovetails really nicely with what I was going to say, which is, social housing is essential social infrastructure. It's something that we should be planning for as the way we plan for kindergartens and schools and all the other things that a functioning and inclusive community has as a part of it. But we don't, or at least we haven't. And so we've had 2 decades or more than 2 decades of underinvestment in social housing in Victoria. Prior to 1996, publicly funded dwelling construction was about 6% of all dwelling construction in Victoria. Come 1996, that fell to an average of 1% and has stayed there until we got to the big housing build now. So we used to plan for it. We used to plan and invest in a really sustained way for social housing. But what we're grappling with now is that 20 years of vacating the field, really. And local governments don't have the mechanisms they need to be able to plan for affordable housing in their communities. And when I say that, I mean we've got the ability to have voluntary agreements, but don't hold many of the cards in having those voluntary negotiations. So one of the things that Chia Vic, given the levy's demise, one of the things that Chia Vic has been calling for in the state election is to give councils that head of power to require, as a condition of planning permits, a contribution to social and affordable housing. Now, that is probably not what the development industry would like to see, because letting 1,000 flowers bloom makes it much more complicated across 79 local government areas, but that's what we're left with as a second best option to something that's clear and consistent and plannable across the state. So I think it's really, from a planning perspective, I think shifting our mindset to think about this as essential social infrastructure is a really useful frame to think about how we need to be investing and planning for the future.
Thank you, Sarah. Over to Libby now.
Thanks, Jago. Thanks, Sarah and Emily, for great opening comments. And I completely agree that with the principle of seeing social housing, housing just generally, as an essential social infrastructure, because without it, of course, no one has a life that can be really lived properly. So with that in mind, I thought I would just try and maybe contextualise in a slightly different way what we often describe at the moment as the housing crisis, and think of that in a much longer context, given that the requirement for, or the experience of housing need or housing crisis has existed here, of course, since Batman sailed up the Birrarung and arrived at that what was that waterfall just down the road here, because of the nature of the dispossession of First Nations people that then ensued, bringing a system of organising the capacity to dwell through capitalist urban markets. So when we brought a system of urban development that we have now to a place where the organisation of dwelling had been very different for at least 80,000 years or more, we fundamentally changed the nature of the relationship between people and the capacity to dwell in this place. And so I think contextualising housing need in that much longer context is a really important thing to do, because what we have now is, of course, a distribution, if you like, of, if you think of the claims in the acknowledgement, and we make these frequently now, of land that's been dispossessed as kind of stolen loot. We have a distribution of that stolen loot that is more and more and more unequal as year on year, which is precisely why we're talking about the problem of unaffordable housing. And the planning system, of course, has been a kind of actor in that process since that day, and therefore I think Jago posed the question to us: why do we think the planning system is a important place to prosecute these arguments and to push for change, because I think the planning system is absolutely essential. It's got to be the central component of changing the very grave situation that we've kind of produced since that day. So taking that idea and thinking about how we kind of discuss and have public discussion about the questions of housing need, that the kind of conventional understanding is that the problem is one of supply, and that we're trying to meet a growing housing population with a thing called stock, and we try and match those things together, and that's sort of where the debate gets locked in. And I think consequently public discussion about meeting housing need is rather unfortunately locked into that kind of framework, and I think all of us kind of struggle to get a kind of a handle on that, and I think that was my reading of it was much of the demise, amongst many things, of the levy that we all agree is very much needed. So a kind of continued market response of supply, supply, supply that does nothing to address the wider context of what is actually going on in the delivery of, in the organisation of, I should say, of the distribution of land and housing is a huge part of the problem, because we kind of come back to relatively kind of simplistic models of we've got to build more on the periphery, or we've got to densify the urban areas, all of which we might need to do, but we forget that there are a whole bunch of other things going on, one of which, of course, is vacancy. If we chose to house all the people who need housing tonight, who are sleeping rough on streets or who are in precarious situations right now across the state, we could do that tonight, because there are enough vacant forms of shelter that exist across Victoria right now to house all of those people. So understanding that what we have is actually a system that we choose to do this all the time. We choose to do it today, and we'll probably choose to do it tomorrow. So what we need is a fundamental rethink of all of those factors, and the planning system is essential to that, because of the links between land and use, and how we regulate that relationship, and then how we distribute the results of that. So I might leave my comments there and hopefully pick up some of the detail that I'm sure we'll all pull out as we proceed. Thanks, Jago.
Oh, that's right, I've got a microphone here. Well, thank you, Emily, Sarah and Libby, for your opening remarks. Let's step back a little bit here and ask ourselves, what scale of stock is needed to meet current need, do you think? Like, let's put some figures out there so we understand the magnitude of this problem.
There's probably a couple of ways of approaching it, and perhaps two is that one, we could aim to keep stock at the current levels of provision, which is about, say, 3.5% for public and social housing. Another probably alternative and arguably better would be to meet need based on measures of rental stress. So we measure rental stress as those in the bottom two quintiles, or 40% of income range. If they're spending more than 30% of their income on their rent or housing, then they're considered to be in stress. So if we take the first approach, we would probably need around 2,000 dwellings a year over the next 30 years to just keep pace with where we are now. So that's just meeting the most vulnerable... Oh, sorry?
Stand still.
Stand still, yes, exactly, sorry. Yeah. That's just to keep us where we're at, and we're obviously conscious that where we're at now is not the best that we could be. If we're to do the alternative approach, which is to address need based on stress, then we probably need around 8,000 dwellings a year for the next 30 years. So, like I said, while we commend the state and federal governments for their commitment, it's pretty clear that they fall short of meeting either one of those targets. So we have a ways to go.
Yeah, only to add that the alternative way to think about it, because you can think about what do we need to do to meet the deficit gap of where we are now. The alternative way is to think about it, if we're thinking about social infrastructure, what proportion of our current growth needs to be social and affordable housing? There's probably science to that SGS can add about what the right percentage is. But actually, I think to get us out of the idea of just saying, oh, we just need to fix the deficit, to we need to embed this as something that's critical social infrastructure is an interesting shift that we should be making in the debate.
Maybe I'll just add and have a little shout out to colleagues. A recent study led by Julie Lawson, who's a colleague of Jago's and mine, funded by Huri, found, fortunately I wrote these numbers down in my phone, that estimated housing need, which picks up on housing stress, people on the wait list, people in what Julie and colleagues defined as sort of latent housing need that's not quite risen to the surface yet, so it's not exactly people putting their hand up or being visible, but who will be very imminently in that need, so they're just on that kind of edge of being precarious. So their estimates were 293,000 households in Victoria, of course most of which are in metropolitan Melbourne. So it suggests that the need right now is very, very large. So I probably think those estimates, you've got a kind of an undercount of what's needed.
Thanks everyone. Another question to put to you is, in the past, social housing has tended to be funded directly out of government revenue generated by general taxes. Specifically, tonight's conversation is about the planning system. Why is it particularly important to leverage the planning system in addition to other more traditional modes of funding social and affordable housing? What's particular about land development that we ought to be hitching the social and affordable housing agenda to?
Yeah, so there's probably two things. The first is drawing on Sarah's point before about social and affordable housing being part of the essential infrastructure, and I think we're increasingly seeing that conversation normalised as social housing being infrastructure. You know, we've had the IV, or Infrastructure Victoria's recent 30-year strategy, which had social housing as part of that as an infrastructure category. And so if we start to see social housing as infrastructure, then we need to treat it in the same way, or planning processes should treat it in the same way that they treat other types of essential infrastructure. It's no different essentially to roads and reticulated services and all of those public open space and parking and all of the things that we need to make places work. So we have contributions and DCPs and parking requirements and open space contributions as well. And so it kind of falls in that basket of, if you are creating holistic places that need all of the things, all of the infrastructure they need to function, then they also need social housing. The other kind of strand is that urban development processes create value, and sometimes, and this is community created value. We as a community decide how we want to regulate places so that they're better. Planning has a place in creating, you know, we map out plans and rezone and create height limits and have density requirements and all sorts of things, because we recognise that the market, just left to rip, has externalities that we want to correct for. So these are community sanctioned development rights, and at times when land is rezoned or we enhance the capacity of a site for development, the value created through that process then ends up in the hands of a small number or a single person, and that's essentially the community's value, which has been captured by private interests. So I think that there's that there's community or social housing is essential infrastructure, and that development processes create value that are for the community and we should share in, which was what the SAC was talking about. Which is, the SAC was kind of more looking in the first strand around essential infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree, Emily, with all those sentiments. I mean, I think the planning systems, like the essential forum where we collectively decide how to regulate and how to organise and distribute the public value of land, if you like, and how that gets to be shared. And at the moment, we're doing that exceptionally badly. We haven't always done it quite this badly, I don't think, even in the colony here in Australia. But we are doing it exceptionally badly at the moment. I think we have a planning system that has and a kind of political culture where we have kind of receded, we as planners have kind of receded into the background, and I think we need to be much more in the centre of those conversations so that we can capture that public value and distribute it differently rather than seeing the only kind of value that can come from land or housing as always just a private asset that gets to be exchanged in the market. You know, we need to recapture the idea that the planning system is where we hold public value from urban development or development generally, and we do that with social purpose in mind, and that social purpose covers a really large range of things, one of which is the delivery of a proper housing arrangement that ensures that everybody has access to safe, affordable housing, and I mean those terms in the things that they mean, not in the affordable housing term that we think we mean sometimes, which is rather meaningless. I mean actually housing that you can actually afford is what I mean by affordable housing, which is not the definition that we currently use. And the planning system is absolutely central to that. So things like land taxes and things like ensuring that vacant land is used properly, things like ensuring that public land doesn't get sold. I know that's not a planning question, but it could be, and it could be the place where we organise that discussion and we have systems of public land value capture.
Oh, the only thing to add is you framed it as, you know, traditionally in Australia it's been funded infrastructure, but that's an Australian anomaly. Like there's lots of other places globally where the planning system is central in delivering social and affordable housing. So it's not necessarily unique to the planning system, but it's unique to the Australian political system that we don't utilise that and we don't capture that public value.
Great, thanks. So next question I have for you is, Libby and Emily partly touched on this, is what are the range of options that we have to leverage value for social and affordable housing, or put it more plainly, financing or funding for social and affordable housing out of land development processes? Obviously the social and affordable housing contribution was put out as a possibility and then withdrawn by the government, but it's not the only option that might be available in the system, though recognising, I think, Sarah's comment that if you allow it to be fragmented down to local government level, it makes it harder for the developers. But what are some other possibilities that could be in this conversation?
Yeah, so obviously the contribution. The big other one, which I think we've talked to quite a bit so far, is around value capture. So we have the windfall gains tax, which applies in pretty limited circumstances currently and doesn't apply to the urban growth zone, rezoning to or from the urban growth zone, which obviously is where a lot of our value is being created and growth is occurring. So, and there's no reason that a levy, the social and affordable housing contributions levy, and the value capture scheme, like an extension of the windfall gains tax, which captures value and hypothecates that for social housing, can't operate in tandem. You might have a slightly decreased capture from value capture because of the levy, but they can operate together at the same time and work with perfectly functional and efficient housing markets. So that's probably the two main processes that I see.
Cool, I've got a list. So here's my list. And I speak as someone who's an advocate of the full decommodification of housing. However, I have kept my list to things that we could do now without having to actually decapitalise the entire world. So, first of all, a land tax that first of all pays rent to First Nations custodians from whom that land was stolen, and we need that because, of course, we're in a treaty negotiation, and so we need an end to a moratorium on the sale of public land, which isn't centrally a planning system thing that can happen, but nonetheless should be linked to planning system processes and outcomes, I think. So we need an immediate end to the sale of public land because of treaty negotiations, but also because that public land will be essential to a future that is dealing with climate change, so it's climate just, is housing just, is economically sensible, and of course ecologically possible. And I think public land is essential to that. We need a purposive, extensive and mandated inclusionary zoning mechanism that doesn't just look to increase supply, but looks at and evaluates existing and future land and housing from the perspective of its social use. And I think we need to change the nature of our conversation in planning and around planning and in all of our public discussions about that to reflect that if we're thinking about housing as a social infrastructure, we need to think about it as a social purpose and not as a commodity that we extract wealth from, even if we still live in that system. I think we also need to look at rent controls. We urgently need to look at rent controls and forms of land price control because that's a huge issue. Rent, we've constructed a system based on rent and the extraction of wealth, and we need to urgently address that. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms we need to change that exist around the planning system. We know what they are, particularly in the taxation system, that further entrench the problems that we know exist. And I think we also need to stop producing approaches and strategies that rest on the things that we know are the problems. So framing housing strategies, for example, that think of housing as a ladder with private ownership at the top of the ladder and public tenancy at the bottom of the ladder, and that somehow the idea is that you move up the ladder. We need to change that way of thinking because it's in fact private ownership and the resting of wealth from urban development and from land that creates the very cycle of uneven development that puts some people at the bottom of the ladder. So we can't rest our strategies on the things that we know produce the very problem that we're trying to address. We have to change that logic. And I think we need a planning planning system, this is my last one, that gives operational power, I was going to say back, to planning. I don't think it's ever had it, but it does in some other systems. Sarah, it's interesting you mentioned other contexts around the world. You know, we have a planning system that delivers vision and strategic thinking and ideas for places that people get engaged in, and we have some good processes around those things, and they work and they function, and yet we have no operational capacity within planning to actually make those things happen, because that's all the market. And I think we need to change that if we are ever going to address the housing crisis as we see it.
Sarah, any thoughts?
I don't think I had much to add. I mean, I think there's there's debate around the minor technical things you can do about when you put a requirement into a planning permit, or whether it's at rezoning, or whether you give value, you allow uplift and you capture the value of uplift, which is what's been done at Fisherman's Bend, for example. They all feel like tinkering at the edges when actually you need to look at the system differently and embed this idea of infrastructure, and that we share the public benefits of that development through investment in this infrastructure.
Great, thanks all. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment and put a proposition to each of you that don't initiatives that levy charges or put a cost on the development of land just add to the market price of housing that homeowners or renters pay. Doesn't this all just flow through to those groups ultimately?
Well, I think not if you design it right. I mean, that's the really critical thing, and that was the critical thing about the social and affordable housing contribution, is that it was designed to give developers enough forward notice that you can put this into your feasibility. It can help determine what you pay for the price of land. So you're actually driving down the cost of land as opposed to driving up the cost of housing. This idea that developers charge what it costs to build a house. Well, the $3 million townhouses in North Melbourne don't cost $3 million to build. It's about what the market can bear in those places. It's got more to do with wages and interest rates of what people can afford to pay. So it is a real myth that, you know, this 1% contribution would have been $20,000 on every single new home everywhere. And so actually some thoughtful economics in the design, which I think maybe Emily could talk to, can actually get you a contribution that creates value for the community without distributing it to the individual home purchaser.
Sounds like you'll go now, Emily.
Yeah, I probably don't. I feel like Sarah's kind of summed that up pretty well. Developers operate in a competitive market. If they could charge more, they probably would be charging more. So I think it's a bit of a farce to say that we're going to pump up house prices. And I think Sarah's correct in saying that it won't be a cost that's passed on to home buyers, but it'll be a cost that's borne by land sellers. So it really comes down to the due diligence of landholders. If you've speculatively bought land, you probably have a disbenefit because of this. But we're assuming in an efficient market where land's being bought and sold and developers are doing their due diligence, then this shouldn't add to or won't add to the cost of housing. So, yeah, I completely agree, Sarah.
Yeah, indeed, I agree too. Shout out to Kate Shaw, who wrote an interesting piece in Overland recently on the levy and reminded me and us that collectively that, of course, when the development industry got narky about the levy, that there was a kind of fairly consistent price at which everyone collectively agreed would be the price at which that would be passed on. And I would have thought one might need to refer that to the Australian Competition Commission or something, because that's actually price fixing. So it's got nothing whatsoever to do with any of these things, and it's precisely as you say, a function of the fact that we are operating in a market. So if we were to control that market a little bit better, change the taxation system, change the way we think about the distribution of housing and land, then we would have a massive impact on precisely that and stop that kind of nonsense from being part of our public discussion and part of the anxiety that I think people will hear when they are considering the kinds of, something like the levy or anything else for that matter, and get sort of anxious about it when that's actually not the case at all. And I think that's a really important kind of public discussion question we need to grapple with as well.
I just wanted to add one thing, and that is, I think Sarah touched on this and we speak about this a lot, it does come down to the design. You know, we're not here to sideline the developers and spring it on them and everyone's in shock and have a horrible time. You know, we want to work with developers. They're an instrumental part of getting the housing we need. We can't replace them, and we have to work with developers, and part of this and bringing in a contribution scheme or the like is early notice, flagging, letting them know so they can factor it into their feasibility assessments. And yeah, we can, potentially start slow and ramp up over time, but it is about notice periods, and we want to be kind and work with developers, and we're wanting our cities and places to work and function in because it benefits us all. So there's no benefit to us in springing a surprise on the development industry as well. So I think that's obviously something that we're all keenly aware of.
Thanks. And next question. Wouldn't it just be simpler to get rid of residential zoning, all those rules and regulations and red tape that tie up the developers from really delivering what they want to deliver, which is cheap, affordable market housing? Couldn't we just make this all, no charges, just make it all simpler and weaken the zoning and regulation system?
I probably have two responses to that question. And the first is we don't have a land supply issue. A lot of our work we do at SGS is around capacity and housing supply and things. We don't really have a land supply issue. The issue is more around turning, and lots of the land supply we do have is generally well serviced in the right locations. The issue that we have is turning that land that's available into housing, and so the hold up is often around land withholding, so people holding on to land to get the right price, or usually that's people without intentions to develop themselves but not turning it over, they want to unsell it. Sometimes developers hold on to land and don't want to flood, or hold on to land and don't develop it because they don't want to flood the market and reduce the price of their product. So it's pretty basic economics. We have enough land, it's about how to stimulate that land and turn it over. And I think there's a second important part to that is, can't we just scrap planning requirements and be done with it? And I think this harks back to some of the conversation we've had earlier about the role and purpose and benefit of planning as a system. We purposely restrict development rights in a way that is for the community benefit. We take time to rezone land and consider applications because we're deciding if it's for the community benefit. So we can't just do this slow chipping away of the planning system because we've established that for a reason, and we we have to be really conscious of that narrative. And I, you know, obviously it's a very common narrative of more land equals more housing. So I think we have to have a clear message as advocates around exactly how that rolls out in reality.
And just to add to that, social and affordable housing by definition are sub-market products. So you can't really rely on a market mechanism to deliver a sub-market product. It just doesn't work that way. That's why it's sub-market. So in terms of delivering, you might deliver more affordable, sort of in the generic affordable sense, but in the specific, you know, targeted to proportion of income and need, that does require a government subsidy to make it work.
Did you want to comment?
Just to add to that point, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that if it was true that, you know, if we just lifted restrictions, amazing, miraculous magic would occur out there because the market would decide on it. I think we would see in all sorts of sectors and areas all of that miraculous stuff happening, and we're not seeing that. So it's you know, patently clear that the market won't deliver anything except what the market wants to deliver, which is not necessarily a socially productive, socially useful organisation of land and housing. We just know that this is true. So we have to have a system that organises and coordinates that social use, and that is the planning system. And you know, the cost of not having that, as you so eloquently outlined it in your opening remarks, is very, very high. And that has ecological impacts, it has social justice impacts, it has city functioning impacts, it has economic feasibility impacts. All those impacts just ripple through everywhere. And when we reduce everything to this kind of singular calculation of how long does it take a developer to get their planning application through the system, or how long does it take to produce 10 houses on a block in Epping, we have fundamentally lost sight of what it is that we're trying to deliver. And that is to all of our disbenefit, I think, and we really need to kind of keep that in mind.
Which is a really great segue to the final question I'll put to the panel before opening it up to the audience, which is, given this is a Planning Institute of Australia event, there's many professional planners in the room, no doubt, and many will watch the recording when it's put up on the website. What should professional planners be thinking or doing in relation to either their day-to-day practice or in relation to policy change and policy debates in relation to this kind of question of leveraging social and affordable housing from urban development? What's the message for the professional planner out of all of this?
Shall I start?
Libby, go ahead.
I've got the microphone
You've got
in my
the microphone.
hand, so I'll start. I think we need to be much... I mean, I'm not a practising planner, right? So it's probably a bit kind of rude, really, for me to comment. But here's what I think we should do. I think we should be much more confident in our skill set and in our capacity to organise ourselves as a profession and a set of, you know, interdisciplines. I don't think of planning as a discipline, I think of it as an interdiscipline, and use that to prosecute and advance a vision for a better society. We used to do this in planning, and I don't think we do it well enough anymore. And I think as an educator in planning, I think we really have an important role in helping students to understand that is their job. Coming out of, you know, an institution like this, sitting in classrooms like this all the time, their job out in the world is to absolutely make that better, and their voice has to be central to that, not kind of, cap doffing to developers or being worried about, or would this add to the price of a house in Epping or whatever it might be. We need to find a collective conversation that is a very, very different one, and I think we can only do that together through perhaps institutes like PIA.
So I completely agree, and I think us organising as planners, and also often planners are working closely with their communities, and I think it's about normalising a conversation with your communities and the people who you're engaging with, and councillors and at the local level about the benefits of planning. Obviously, it's a bit of a political game as well around getting the SAC and getting up, and then getting knocked down. And if people understand the benefits, there's more likely to be a groundswell around them. And at the moment it's quite tricky because our social and public housing stock has been residualised to such a level that it's catering for households who are very vulnerable and the most needy. So, communities understanding that if we expand social and affordable housing supply along those lines of needing a greater level of those experiencing rental stress, that the benefits aren't just for the households who are acutely in need, which is kind of what's happening now. It has a whole range of benefits, like I said at the start, around like better labour markets and health system improvements and educational outcomes, and obviously that has a flow through to everybody. So I think it is around normalising. Planners have a really important role to play in normalising this conversation with their communities and their elected officials at the local level.
I've got a much more prosaic ask, which is encourage the council to have a social and affordable housing strategy, because not everyone, I actually think we've done a little bit of work with councils at GIA, and I think we've got about 30 councils that have a social and affordable housing strategy. There's 79 across the state. And that strategy, and the strategies, I've mentioned before that councils don't have the levers to implement a lot of those strategies, but having your strategy point towards the levers you need helps build the pressure for getting those things implemented at a state level through the planning system. And there are things that councils can do at a local level as well. So looking at your own land, looking at your air rights, all those other things that innovative councils have been doing for a very long time now. But actually planning for social and affordable housing is a really important part of planners' roles.
Right, thank you. Well, we might open it up to those in the room now. We've got some time for your own questions. If you'd like to ask a question of one or all of the panel, please put your hand up and we'll try and deliver a microphone to you. Oh, you'll take it? Okay, thanks, Diego. And maybe tell us who you are as you speak.
Thanks. My name's Sean. I'm an interested citizen. I'm interested to hear the panel's thoughts on how important it is to tie the funding source of providing affordable housing, social housing, with its provision. So the social and affordable housing contribution was sort of shot down, and tying the provision of housing to mechanisms like that sort of puts at risk the provision of that housing. And if providing social housing is really important and infrastructure, shouldn't that be something that government funds anyhow, and then the funding source is a separate question for government to work out?
I think the answer is actually both. So absolutely, state governments and federal governments should be investing. The history of housing in Australia is that it's a 2-for-1 contribution, $2 from the Commonwealth, $1 from the states. And I think that development has a role to play in making a contribution as well, because the gap we have at the moment is so deep and so wide that we need to be pouring all levels of government and the market really into that.
Thanks for the question. I think I actually agree with Sarah, a bit of both. It's absolutely the case that private development must contribute to other socially productive uses, and so we must have some kind of value capture built into the system. But I agree with you that then breaks the connection between those two things, and perhaps one of the things I think I probably haven't said in my comments this evening is the very great importance of directly funding the delivery of public housing by a much larger margin than we're currently doing, and ensuring that the mechanisms by which we do that are the direct funding of public housing, both in its new build and in its maintenance. because what we don't have at the moment is a proper line of a budget that actually supports public housing, to stay public housing, to be valued as a socially productive housing use, and to be expanded upon, and when we need to radically change that situation.
I'm clear on the question, but not quite clear on my response, so I might sit this one out.
Okay, no problem. I think we have another question over here. Let us know who you are.
Hi, hello, I'm Mike Collins, I work for Moreland Council. Just a quick comment just on the latter comments about local government. Local government is organising and has in the last few years at an officer level through the Intercouncil Affordable Housing Forum become, I think, quite an influential voice. And also a tremendously powerful kind of self-resourcing, kind of self-organising thing across planets across Victoria. And also we will be seeing, hopefully, it sees the light of day, a local government compact between Homes Victoria and local governments, which has been led by the MAV, who I will give credit to have come on strong out of nowhere into the affordable housing space in the last couple of years, and you know, there is some strength there. Okay, I have a question. I think there should be a local government person on the panel anyway. 2018, the Planning Environment Act got changed. It made affordable housing an objective of the Act. And it brought in this concept of moderate, low and very low incomes. I guess my question to the panel is, and this is in the context of the type of outcomes we're managing to squeeze out of private developers in terms of affordable housing, is do you think we should get rid of the moderate income band so that we can actually get whatever we can get out of the housing system under the current situation, or maybe a better situation, that it can actually be housing that's for people at most need at low and very low incomes?
Let me start by saying more power to your hand, Mike. Like, in local government, there are elements of local government that have been driving this conversation, and giving those local governments the tools to drive even further, I think, is really important. The point you raise about what can be eked out of voluntary agreements is really, really important, because while that was an important change to the Planning Environment Act, making it voluntary doesn't, the power and leverage in the conversation is not there. So what has ended up with most of the voluntary agreements is developers saying, yes, we will include social and affordable housing, and we will sell it at a slight discount, 75%, or at cost, to a community housing agency, who then goes to government and gets it funded. So there's not a lot of additionality created in that voluntary system. It's essentially government-funded housing that would have been funded one way or another. It just happens to be in this particular location. So it's not a great system that's yielding additionality to start with. To your specific question, should we get rid of the moderate band? It seems to me that there's a bit of a disconnect, not a disconnect, there's a diversity of opinion across councils about what they want. Because some councils want to use these things to get key worker housing, which is in that moderate income band. So it's really, you know, for my purposes, absolutely, yeah, let's make it all 25% of income. But there is a diversity of opinion across local council and across the community about what we need to be investing in.
It's a great question, Mark. Thank you. Hello. I totally agree local government possibly should be on the panel and it must be a much greater player. I'm not sure I have a view particularly. I would need to think about it more around the moderate income band. I think we drift into then a problem of a kind of binary that the market delivers anything that isn't low income housing, and I'm not sure. I think absolutely the market shouldn't be delivering low income housing, because the form of low-income housing that it does deliver is appalling, and no one should be in it. So that's not a good outcome. And so we obviously need direct funding and direct government provision of low-income housing. I just feel we're missing a trick on these questions again about what does affordable mean in this context. So if we had a proper mandated levy that required everyone to pool resources into a central fund that then we collectively decided through government mechanisms to deliver an equitable housing system, we would have a very different system, and we wouldn't be caught in this kind of odd conversation about should we do a little bit of like 75% of market rent here, which isn't affordable, and should we do a little bit of a smattering of something over here, like you're saying, Sarah. I think we've caught ourselves in this really, frankly, crappy conversation where we can't imagine our way out of those very limited options. Plus, all of that conversation still does not get at the high levels of vacant land and vacant housing that are sitting in all those pockets all around the city, all around the state. So we miss that entire realm of what is currently sitting as socially useless land and housing because it's not putting proper roofs over people's heads. So I didn't answer your question.
Emily, maybe 1 minute for you at the most, because we're going to have to
less than a minute, probably.
We're going to have to wrap up in a moment.
Yes, all I was going to add is I probably don't know enough in this space to have an educated opinion about it. Aside from that, I would be completely open to how it doesn't work and why. Perhaps the benefit that I say, I agree with Sarah around perhaps it gives some opportunities for mid-range and key worker housing, which I know some councils are really kind of aiming for. If it allows councils to negotiate on an outcome that they wouldn't have otherwise got if it wasn't there, then I guess it's a good thing. But like I said, it's something I probably haven't turned my mind to a great extent. Would be happy to be convinced either way.
Great, thanks, Emily. We're going to have 2 more questions. Okay.
Very quick ones, they promise.
Okay, we'll keep going. I know the recording is going to cut off automatically at 6:30, so we may miss the end there. So maybe we'll continue with the questions, but for the purposes of the video recording, I'll do the wrap up now. So then our editing will be fine. So look, just wrapping up, I'd really like to thank our panellists tonight, Sarah Tui, Emily Hobbs and Libby Porter, for their very insightful and expert contributions. I'd like to thank the Planning Institute of Australia, our partners in this event, for helping organise and publicise the event and being part of the discussions leading up to it. And I'd also like to thank Diego Papadello, who's been helping with the promotions and marketing and doing the microphone ringing around tonight, and also Jenny Lucy from the Centre for Urban Research, who helped with some of the organising, and my colleague Andrew Butt as well, who has been helping with the overall series. So thanks everyone. We'll wrap it up here, and hope you think of housing come November when you're in the voting booth. And we'll take some further questions then.
Yes, of course. I think that we fit it all in, and I'd wanted to extend the thank you as well to the entire PIA team. Bella Yoma was here, and she took care of marketing.